Hi, my name is Hedenus, and I will here give you a short introduction to ethics. So, what is ethics? Ethics is about the systematic reasoning around what is the right thing to do and what is morally variable. And the key word here is systematic reasoning, because often we can think that, yeah, I think this is good, you think that is good, but the idea with ethics is that we can actually reason about this, and we can have a possibility to find some common ground. An alternative view is relativism, and that is basically that there are no universal ethics, and there's no reason to judge people in history or in other societies on what they do or don't. And that means that things like slavery or the Holocaust is not really possible to make moral judgment from today. You just say, hey, that is what people thought was good at that point in time. However, most people find this idea rather appalling, and also there is something problematic in that to say that no universal ethics is actually a universal ethical statement in itself. Then we have another possible position, and that is absolutism. And that is to say, we have a set of universal rules, they are applicable in all settings, there are no room for discussions, they are constant over time in different cultures. And this is typically what you have in several religious codes. However, this position is also problematic because, of course, contexts do matter. And sometimes these rules come in conflict. And how do you resolve these conflicts? And the more like scientific endeavor of ethics is to try to cover this middle ground between relativism and absolutism and find some kind of ideas of how to resolve these kinds of ethical issues. Ethics is about the systematic reasonings about moral issues. But when we make an ethical theory, we need to have some kind of rational foundations, some criteria, how we can say that one ethical framework are superior or inferior to another ethical framework. And there are three such criteria that are most often used in ethics. The first one is consistency, that the principles within an ethical theory should not be contradictory. For instance, if you say that everyone have the right to live where they want to, but also say that disabled people should not live in my neighborhood, then you clearly have two different principles that are contradictory. So in an ethical theory, it's important to find principles that are not contradictory. The second criteria is universalism, and that the principles in an ethical theory should apply to all similarly situated individuals. That doesn't mean that all principles should apply for all people the same, because people might be in different situations. For instance, you might have different principles for kids compared to elderly, or you have different principles for vulnerable people compared to powerful people, but still the principles should be able to apply to all people. So for instance, to have the principles, it's never right to steal, but then to say, I really want that iPad, so it's okay for me to steal it, that's typically not a universal kind of principle. The third criteria is intuitive. In the end, what we rely on when it comes to ethics are our ethical intuitions. We have a gut feeling what we feel is right or wrong. The problem is that our intuitions, they are very seldom neither consistent nor universal. So that is the reason why we try to make this framework that are consistent and universal, but then we have to test them towards our intuitions to see that they match actually. So an ethical theory should not, at least in everyday situation, lead to non-intuitive recommendations. So, for instance, it's easy to make an ethical theory that are both consistent and universal. For instance, you shall kill all people you meet, both consistent and universal, but it's not very intuitive. So it's important to find principles that are also intuitive in the sense that we have the gut feeling that in everyday situations, these principles, this framework leads to things that we think is good. Another important distinction in ethics is the one between final and instrumental values. Final value is a value that has an end in itself, that we think is morally valuable in itself, whereas an instrumental value is a value as a means or contributor to another value. So there's a large discussion around what really have final value. One idea could be, for instance, that knowledge has a final value. A world with more knowledge is a better world, and therefore we should try to enhance the amount of knowledge we have in society. If you think that is a final value, then it makes sense to say that studying or performing research has an instrumental value to reach this final value. But it's not valuable in itself to do research. It is valuable since it contributes to increasing the amount of knowledge. Another typical instrumental value is, of course, money, that you can use for many different purposes, but very few people would argue that money has a final value, that is an end in itself. Other typical final values that people argue for is that happiness, if we make people happier, that is a final value, or beauty, or that life has a final value, and you shouldn't, in any cases, actually kill people. So to understand what you think has a final value and what other people think has a final value is often a good way to better understand why you actually disagree about what to do in concrete ethical situations. To read more about ethics and the normative aspect of sustainable development, you can read in chapter 4 of the book Sustainable Development, Nuances and Perspectives.